Waiting for it to load. Hey there, psychology students. It's Mr. Everton, and this is an unusual situation. I'm going to try to cram an entire unit into a module. A module. Um, yeah. So this module apparently will last 2 weeks. I'm going to have a few different screencast lectures and a few different activities for you to do. And our unit is on mental disorders. And if you were in my classroom right now, you would see on the board written the essential question, what is crazy? So hopefully before you've watched the screencast, I would like for you to go on Canvas and answer this question in your own words and then see what some other people have written as well. What is crazy? What do you think it means to be crazy? And I will tell you that crazy is kind of a problematic word that I would discourage you from. I say crazy all the time, but just think a moment about what it means to say that something is crazy. Um, we're talking about mental illness here. We're talking about psychological disorders. And the goal of this lesson is to describe the criteria used to evaluate a disorder and apply those criteria to ADHD, which is a, um, a disorder. So a lot of times when we talk about psychological disorders, we think of, people who are dangerous in some way or who've been locked up and separated from the rest of society in some sort of mental hospital or asylum. A lot of times we think of people like Hannibal Lecter, who you see pictured here. But one of the goals of this module is to help us reframe how we think of psychological disorders. Think of psychological disorders as something that are incredibly common, and that there's a whole wide variety of them, right? Just like you can have a physical disorder that could be anywhere from like the common cold to like terminal pancreatic cancer. And there's like, physical disorders that are very minor and physical disorders that are extreme and life threatening. The same is true of psychological disorders. Incorporates the term incorporates many, many different things. And I want to try to help you decrease the stigma that you feel about people who suffer from psychological disorders, because most people including yourself, probably do or will or have suffered from psychological disorders at some point in their lifetime. And I include myself in that. I have psychological disorders. So, a psychological disorder is a pattern of thought, feelings, or behaviors that are three words here: deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional. And I'm going to unpack what those three words mean, um, each like one at a time. So it's a pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's not one thing. There's no like one behavior or thought or feeling that is disordered. They have to work together as a group in order before we say that something is disordered. A psychological disorder is behavior that's going to be different. It's going to be outside the norm in quotation marks. And we know that like it's great not to be normal. And what does normal mean, right? Like nobody's normal. But you can say that if somebody sees things that aren't really there, that's unusual, that most people don't experience that behavior. You can say that if people are incredibly afraid of going over a bridge to the point where they won't drive across a bridge under any circumstances, that's unusual. That's what I mean by deviant, something that's really out of the norm. When we talk about psychological disorders, we're also talking about behaviors and thoughts that are distressful, that make the person who's experiencing them unhappy, that makes them wish that they didn't have those things and they're unable to stop having them. And then we also are talking about things that are dysfunctional, which means that you're not able to function. You're not able to do the things that you would do in a normal daily life. Maybe you're not able to go to school. Maybe you're not able to have healthy, normal relationships with other people. Like people don't want to be friends with you because you have these distressful behaviors and thoughts and feelings. So the DSM-5, that's a Roman numeral 5. You can write it with the V or the 5, doesn't matter. The DSM-5 stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it's a book, a very expensive, large, thick reference book that doctors and psychologists and all kinds of people use to define disorders. It lists the symptoms of these disorders. And it's used, as I just said, by everybody who has an interest in mental health: psychologists, insurance companies, the legal system. Anybody who needs to know if somebody has a mental disorder, they confer. That's the wrong word. They refer, there we go, to the DSM-5 in order to compare the behaviors and thoughts and feelings of the person in question with the symptoms that are listed in the DSM-5. And the DSM-5, called the DSM-5 because it's the fifth version of this book. This book has been evolving, which means gradually changing over time since 1952 when the first edition was published. And so over time, our society's idea of what is a mental disorder has changed. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had to make the book again, right? So there are things that used to be thought of as being a disorder that are now no longer thought to be a disorder. For example, sexual orientation. It used to be that if you were gay, that the DSM-5 said that you had a mental disorder, or that if you were transgender, that the DSM-5 would say that you had a mental disorder. That's different from sexual orientation. But anyway, it's no longer the case. In the 1970s, the DSM-5 stopped referring to homosexuality as a mental disorder. The newest version of the DSM, the DSM-5, has changed its evaluation of Asperger's syndrome and started to classify that as a disorder, which is very controversial for some people. There are people who think that it shouldn't be. And so this is something that is, I know we have a tendency to look at a reference book like the DSM-5 and think, oh, well, it's in the DSM-5, therefore it must be true. Therefore, it is a disorder, and this is what it is. But I want you to realize that this is a discussion that psychologists and doctors have about whether something is a disorder. They make choices about what they want to put in that book, and they will make different choices later, and we'll have a DSM-6. So just because it's in the DSM doesn't mean it's like set in stone, like this is a mental disorder. So one example of a mental disorder that many people suffer from, very common, is ADHD. Stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And you might have ADHD. You definitely know people who have ADHD. And this is a disorder that makes it hard for some people to pay attention. Sometimes it makes it really hard for people to control their own behavior. They become really impulsive and they have a hard time sitting still. They experience hyperactivity, right? Like they're just bouncing off the walls. They can't sit still in a chair. And that can cause problems, particularly if you are a kid and you are in a public school and you have a teacher who expects you to sit in a chair all day and do work. That creates issues for you at school. So there's a reading on Canvas that I want you to do about ADHD. And I want you to think about, is ADHD overdiagnosed? And if so, why? Why is it that we diagnose so many people with ADHD? So use the reading to assess that question. And I will have a different screencast for you when you're finished with that on schizophrenia. And yeah, thanks for watching. And I'll talk.